I mean, could it be that God is actually curious and compassionate?
Oh.
I think that's a game changer for most folks. And one of the things that I understood even in writing this book, particularly on the heels of the narcissism book, is that people who are reckoning with pain, particularly with abuse, often have a hard time finding their way back to God. What they've known of God through the lens of the abusive pastor or the church system or whatever it might be is a God who is not kind, is not curious, is not humble, but it's a God who's authoritarian and angry and bullying. And so I think my hope, my prayer in this was that wherever people find themselves, I'm certainly not, as you know, in the work we do, we're not in a rush. People will get there in their own timing, but might they find their way to some curiosity themselves about a God who's just as curious about them.
Welcome to 3%. We're your hosts, Jamie Hay.
And I'm Blake Roberts.
We're two best friends, fathers, husbands, and just two guys trying to figure it out.
We're also therapists, which is probably a pretty important part.
That's true.
And we believe that at our best, people are 97% honest with themselves and others. And it's that hidden 3% of emotions, needs, desires, and behaviors that we keep to ourselves that keep us bound to shame and loneliness, from which many of our issues stem.
Each week on this podcast, we'll interview leaders in the fields of psychology, theology, arts, and athletics to explore holistic masculinity. We're not here to tell you the man you need to be, but we are here to help you explore what gets in the way of being the man you want to be.
We're going to help you develop courage and give you the tools to share your 3% in the relationships that matter most so you can more deeply connect with yourself, God, and others. So, pull up a chair.
Let's get into it.
So let's be honest. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. Let's be honest.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of 3%. Got to buckle up today. Chuck, that's something that Blake has started introing a lot of our podcasts with. And
unknowingly.
So I like to rib him by continuing that. And hopefully it'll just become a thing. But
Appreciate that.
Yeah, you need to buckle up today because we have Dr. Chuck DeGroat on the podcast today. And Dr. Chuck is a pastor, professor, therapist. He's the executive director of the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Program at Western Theological Seminary and a licensed therapist himself with a deep passion for wholeness and self-awareness. I believe you've written 5 books in all, which is aspirational for Blake and I, including When Narcissism Comes to Church, which has sparked a lot of conversations even within my own church and in my community. So, Chuck, we're really glad to have you here, and specifically what we want to talk about today is your newest book, which came out in, correct me if I'm wrong here, but October of last year, Healing What's Within, Coming Home to Yourself and to God When You're Wounded, Weary, and Wandering. Feels like even in the title that you might have written that book to who we believe is kind of the audience of this community. Welcome, Chuck. We're really glad you're here. And if you would add anything to the brag sheet that I just mentioned, we'd love to hear it. I know on other podcasts I've heard that you have 2 daughters.
Yeah, that's right. 2 adult daughters now. My oldest got married last summer, and if you have daughters, prepare yourself for the dance, because I bawled the entire time. I don't know that I stopped. I mean, I think we mostly just tried to get through it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not ready for that.
My oldest is a student in our clinical counseling program, so that's kind of fun too.
No way.
Yeah.
That is awesome.
That's neat.
Yeah.
What's that experience like? Have you been a teacher for her at all?
Yeah. She's been in class. She's currently in class, and it's great. We've got a great relationship. She has a friend who keeps track of the number of times I reference her in class and the number of times I cry in class. And so I feel a little bit like I'm being watched in a different kind of way, but and we're so different too. So it's been fun. She's going to be a different therapist. She's a different human being, right? And so it's just fun watching her unique sort of blossoming in this context. So Yeah.
That's really
so
neat.
cool.
Yeah, I'm super thrilled you're here. I've followed you and read your words for a long time, and I mean almost everything that comes out of your mouth or your hand onto paper is, I think, like Jamie alluded to in the beginning, feels like directly spoken to me, and so it's been a big gift. And one of the things that I was thinking about this on the way here this morning that I really appreciate, and something that I've heard you talk a lot about, that I kind of just want to say real quick, even for the listener, to kind of like prep them for what we're going to talk about today, is the way that you reframe, or the way that you frame the Genesis story. And I may have like altered it a little bit, so correct me if I have, but one of the things that has stuck with me the most is the way you talk about how God asks the question to Adam in the garden when he says, "Where are you?" And it's something that I've kind of stolen from you. And, you know, as a therapist, the two of you know this, at the beginning of a session, it's kind of like, how do you start? What do you say? The general, like, how's it going? Or, you know, but how do you dive into that space? And I just like unintentionally started saying, "So where are you today?"
Yeah.
And as I've talked about it with clients, and because of the way you frame it, the question of where are you, or even why do you do that, we so often hear with this within our own minds, and then maybe even how we perceive God asking that question with like judgment or criticism or disappointment. But reframing that, the question of where are you or why do you do that, is not a bad question, but the tone of it, when it's one of more empathy and curiosity and kindness, can be so inviting. And so that, I was just thinking about that this morning, and I was like, I just want to say, like, start with that, even for the listener to be thinking like, where are you? Where are you as you listen to this?
Especially because part of our whole goal, as I kind of told you about before, is to seek greater connection with ourselves, God, and others. And I know that question, the where are you, is part of your 3 questions, the Genesis examination. And I think, like Blake was saying, it kind of draws me into that connection with self in a really unique way. We'd love for you to give a little more context to what Blake is talking about,
Yeah.
because of how applicable I think both of us feel it would be to everybody listening.
Yeah, it is really a different way of reading that story and of hearing God, right? I mean, I know in the tradition that I grew up in, the biblical story began with sin, with how broken we are, how sinful we are, and so that was in me, you know, that was sort of ingrained from a very early age. And I think it was probably in the 90s reading Nouwen and Keating and Buechner and folks like that, where they'd riff on this kind of thing every now and then. I begin to wonder, is God angry? Was God angry? How does God show up? And it just strikes me out, just to give a little context to it, that God is walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Which is to say, he was walking in the garden when he and Adam and Eve would normally take their walks. When the sun was going down, it wasn't as hot as it would have been at noon, and wondering where his friends are. And so it's a cry of friendship, right? And where are you? It's the time of day we walk. I miss you. That was something for me as I began to lead retreats on this years ago, that struck me as really important. Of course, I make the connection in the book to the parallels with the prodigal son story too, of a father who pursues his lost son, right? And so there's something there, something about God's kindness that we see in a story that for me was at least in my upbringing, was a story of tragedy, how it all went wrong. And
Right.
I get that it does, because our decisions have consequences, right? I don't want to minimize that at all. There's a rupture, there's a shattering of shalom that happens in the 1,185 chapters to come, right? But I think we learn something about God's heart right there in that first approach. Where are you?
Yeah, even when I was first reading, like, this was a much newer idea to me. I'm just newer to your content than Blake is. And so when I first heard you talk about that, I had to like stop what I was doing because of how how much of a shift it was for me to recognize that even within me, which is what you're talking about, this recognizing that part of the way that I experienced the gospel was from a foundational idea that God was not asking me questions with compassion. And you asking it that way and reframing to God might be seeking me with a heart of, where are you? And even the last question of, where are you taking your hunger and thirst? I fell out when I heard that one. I was just thinking to myself how compassionate God could be to not look at me and say, have you done the exact wrong thing? But rather, where are you taking this beautiful desire I've given you? And where have you taken it that is not me?
Yeah.
So helpful.
That particular question, that third question, that was the tricky one for me because, the first two, where are you and who told you, are very beautiful, open-ended questions. And we know as therapists that that's the right kind of question to ask, right? The
Right.
open-ended
Yeah.
question.
Right.
And then the third question comes along and it's, have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from, right? And it's just a simple yes, no. And I wondered, so what's the heart here? Like, what's the heart behind that? And that's when, again, on retreat a number of years ago, it sort of came to me. Where have you taken your hunger and thirst? And then if you take it to the Gospels and the question that Jesus asks more than any other question, what do you really want? What do you really long for? What are you really hungry for? What are you really thirsty for? And that's when, you guys do this for a living and so do I. That's when you get to the good stuff.
Right. Yeah. And even those first two questions are so important, and something that I feel like, even listening to you talk about them, I was like, wow, this is kind of the biblical foundation of what feels like the first couple of steps of 12-step, or really the first 4. In the 4th step, you do this inventory where it talks about who hurt you, what happened, what did you learn from it, and what do you choose to believe today? And my sponsor had me reframe it to, who hurt you, what happened, what did you learn from it, and what do you think God would want you to believe about it himself? And as you were talking, I'm hearing, where are you being the first, who hurt you, what happened, and what did you learn from it? Well, who hurt, what happened and what did you learn from it is really, where are you? And then who told you would be the who hurt you, and kind of what did you learn from it integrated into a person question.
Yeah.
And then where are you taking your hunger and thirst is why you're in 12-step.
Yeah.
And it's such an interesting, I use that all the time to help people frame up, or really to dissect their resentments, and to have those 3 Genesis questions frame it in a biblical context, an integrative context. Yeah, it really set me back for a minute.
Yeah, could it be that God is actually curious and compassionate? I think that's a game changer for most folks. And one of the things that I understood even in writing this book, particularly on the heels of the narcissism book, is that people who are reckoning with pain, particularly with abuse, often have a hard time finding their way back to God. What they've known of God through the lens of, the abusive pastor or the church system or whatever it might be, is a God who is not kind, is not curious, is not humble, but it's a God who's authoritarian and angry and bullying. And so I think my hope, my prayer in this was that wherever people find themselves, I'm certainly not, as you know, in the work we do, we're not in a rush. People will get there in their own timing, but might they find their way to some curiosity themselves about a God who's just as curious about them, compassionate, kind, pursuing. Yeah.
I see one of I want to steal that one, but I'm going to let you do it because
I think it needs to go last.
Okay. Yeah. It's such a good question. And I know he's going to be excited to talk about it.
Like, what is the meaning of life? Or
Yeah. Yeah.
No. I'm curious. I know this is a loaded question. I'm thinking of how listeners are going to feel, not yet having heard feedback. But one thing that I want to be intentional about is a lot of the stuff that we talk about on here with these guests that we have talked about can be like deeply nuanced and complex
And new.
And I know that as therapists, I'll speak for myself. I feel very comfortable swimming in those waters, right? But holding this balance of like talking about these things and making it a little bit practical, like naming some things that people might go, oh, that lives in me, and I didn't even know it did until I heard Chuck and Blake and Jamie talk about it. And then a little bit of like, what do I do with that? So as you're talking about a God who like might be curious and compassionate, and somebody who has a story of abuse or trauma or just experiences maybe in their family system or the larger systems they've been a part of where they haven't experienced that type of kindness or curiosity or compassion. And I know this is a loaded question. To think about that as like a new mindset shift is helpful in one thing. But
Yeah.
the three of us know that sometimes a mindset shift doesn't like change things.
No.
So what might you offer, even in a practical sense? You know, I want to be like, go to therapy, which is a very
Yeah.
kind of cop-out answer sometimes. But to somebody who's listening and going like, okay, yeah, I want to believe that God can be curious and compassionate toward me, but just like trying to think of that, like when my story tells me otherwise,
Yeah. Yeah.
what is it like one thing that you might offer to help somebody move toward believing that or experiencing that
Yeah.
a little more?
Yeah. Well, I know some are hesitant about the language of deconstruction nowadays, right? But
Sure.
we do that work in a sense in therapy, and I've long said that in the history of the church, there's always been language for a kind of disorientation. In fact, Walter Brueggemann says in the Psalms, there are Psalms of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. And some sense of that rhythm is seen throughout church history. St. John of the Cross talked about the dark night of the soul. St. Teresa of Avila talked about the fourth dwelling of the interior castle being one in which we're faced with the end of ourselves in a sense. We come to a moment of crisis, disorientation, and I think we steward those places of disorientation in people's lives. And
Yeah.
what that means is that for each of us in our own way, there's no cookie cutter way, there's no recipe for this. It just happens in the normal course of things. Each of us has to face the deep questions of, how did I come to believe that about God? What about my family story? What about my early imprint of what it means to be a father or a mother? Do I need to look at? This is some of the work that we do. So I think all good Christian therapists are spiritual directors in a sense too, because we're teasing these things out with folks. And I think for each of your listeners, it's important to get curious about your early story. How's your imagination of God, how God shows up, formed? And when I ask folks about that, I mean, oftentimes I'll get some version of God's angry, God's distant, God isn't curious, God's really mad at me, God is probably ashamed of me, all these kinds of things that I think invite us to get curious about our stories, about our early relational models of God, and to in the midst of that curious, to begin to wonder, might God show up differently? And I think the book is my little contribution to that conversation, right?
Yeah.
Could it be that God is actually more kind, more curious, more compassionate than you might have imagined? And what would the implications of that be?
That's beautiful.
Yeah, and as you talk about that, it's shifting the focus away from, even as people are looking at earlier experiences, it's shifting away from focusing on who hurt you or what, and focusing more on the trauma of what happened within.
That's right.
And
Yeah,
that's
an important distinction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This focus, I think you said, it can become an endless loop.
Yeah.
of focusing on just the experience of it and the outrage of that.
Yeah.
Shifting more towards, and I think that's a familiar experience. I mean, just to give you a 30,000 foot, I was the abused by a pastor guy who developed an addiction out of that. And I spun on that wheel of outrage and focusing on my power that I pretended I held through resentment for a long time, and still feel that I am now getting to the point where I'm recognizing what am I protecting within, and how are those protection measures helping me, or realistically, how are they harming my relationship with myself, God, and others?
Yeah.
And I think it's awesome that you're encouraging the listeners to focus on, where did you learn this about God?
Yeah.
Where in your experience did you learn this? And I want to encourage them, as you encouraged me, make sure that as you find where you learned it, that you don't get fixated. Well, it's okay if you do at first, but maybe take this to somebody you trust.
Yeah.
So that you don't get fixated on, this is their fault.
Yeah.
And you forget to navigate to, okay, is that what you want?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Because the reality is, I experienced harm and spiritual abuse. The unique traumatic imprint, the wound, trauma is Greek for wound, looks different inside of me, looks different inside of you, and our unique ways of coping are different, right? So I think that's where it doesn't help to compare. We might find some solidarity with someone who has experienced something of the same harm, and that could be important. Obviously, I think that's the case with addiction journeys as well. It's important to have people who care, people who will sit with you, but I do think that as I turned that corner beyond resentment, beyond what happened to me, to what was happening within me, the particularity of my wound is what I had to wrestle with, right? And that, we haven't talked about our nervous systems yet, but we're all therapists. We all traffic in nervous system regulation. My particular embodiment of dysregulation in the world looked pretty spiritual. I mean, I turned my pain into hard work for the kingdom of God, and I was out in San Francisco pastoring and leading a variety of initiatives, and all the while pretty profoundly disconnected from myself, from God, and from others. And so it's sometimes tough to see when things are going well for you, or in your dysregulated hyper-arousal is the language we use in terms of nervous systems, and in our chronic busyness, when we're doing good things for the kingdom of God, right? It takes some curiosity, again, to come back to that same word. Yeah. So it does make me curious, Jamie, for you, what you had to take a look at as you discovered the uniqueness of your own wound, what you were invited to look at.
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like it's one I'm still exploring. What we have landed on, my therapist and I, which is funny, Blake and I have the same therapist. What we've landed on recently is that my outrage, or my rage, is really is my protector of those exile
that's right.
wounds, which is, for everybody listening, kind of internal family systems language for, think of the movie Inside Out. That's the closest thing I can use when I talk to people about the kind of foundational components of IFS. Right. Think about all these little parts of you. When I talk about an exile, I'm talking about a part of me that I suppressed or put aside or didn't want to listen to, or and Blake is so much smarter in this than I am, but I'm going to try to make my way through this. I have a protector part of those wounds that rages in many different forms, and sometimes I have to have a firefighter of sexual addiction to numb the protector who is really trying to do a good thing for me. But boy, the rage is intense. And so what I'm having to look at is, how do I care for those wounds in a way that actually asks for my need, which is not something that I necessarily just learned from the abusive relationship. How I address and care for my needs is not a pattern and attachment that I formed just there.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Yeah.
think the hard work is, for me, has been looking at the where are you question
Yeah.
and trying to actually give myself permission to not focus on the who told you.
Mm-hmm.
The who told you is helpful, but I got too fixated
Mm-hmm.
or worried that I was saying this dishonoring thing to the who told you part. So I had to kind of let go of that part and just get to where are you and where are you taking your hunger and thirst, so that I can get more at when I notice my rage, I can notice that likely means I'm not raging for no purpose. It means that I have a really soft part of me that feels really not safe.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's been an interesting journey for sure. I heard you talk about people call it resilience in you when you were, as you said, hyper arousal of your nervous system. You were leading all of these things. And I think probably people looked at me and said, you're so resilient. Like you came out of this years long spiritual, sexual, emotional, abusive relationship. And you're like going and pursuing things when the reality was, in some ways, it felt like just running away to me.
Chuck, could you give a maybe quick overview, 30,000-foot view of these terms that we're familiar with that we're throwing around: dysregulation, hyperarousal, hyperarousal, and hypoarousal?
Yeah.
Just for somebody that may kind of understand it or maybe are like, what are they talking about?
Yeah. Well, this is the language of the nervous system, and these are ways of talking about how our bodies cope with the reality of living in a traumatized world and engaging our own trauma. And so the way I talk about it in the book is that we're created for what I call home, which in nervous system terms is an experience of the ventral vagal part of our nervous system, where we experience connection and creativity and curiosity and play and pleasure and delight and all the goodness of life. That's Genesis 1 and 2, Revelation 21 and 22. But the reality is that we live in a broken and traumatized world, and our nervous systems, regardless of our perception, regardless of our awareness, our nervous systems are always neurocepting, which is to say you've got a sort of an internal radar asking, is this safe? Am I safe? When I came onto the podcast today, I met Jamie, I met Blake, found out that they were therapists. My nervous system settled just a little bit. I thought, okay, I can do this. These guys are safe. But we're constantly neurocepting, and our bodies adjust in particular ways, right? And one of the ways that our bodies adjust is by going into modes of hyperarousal, fight, flight. People are familiar with fight or flight. There are others too, but we might go into, you were in a rage mode, Jamie. So your body was in fight, right?
Yeah.
Or if that's just too overwhelming and that's not doing it for us, that's not protecting us, our bodies can go into hypoarousal, which is to say we might freeze or shut down. There were days when I just didn't want to get out of bed. Like I'm just done. I can't do it. And so our bodies are fascinating and glorious, and ultimately our nervous systems are trying to help us, but we can get stuck in these modes of being, which at times we call parts of us that fight, parts of us that flight, parts of us that appease and fawn, parts of us that shut down. And it's important to be aware that each of us has a lot of that going on all at the same time, all the time. And so part of our work is to get real curious about how that works in Jamie's life and in Blake's life and in Chuck's life in a way that's unique and different than anyone else. Again, there's no one size fits all when it comes to this work. It's, how have you navigated your own spiritual abuse, Jamie? And what parts of you tend to go into hyperarousal or hypoarousal? And how do you find your way home to union, communion, connection, play, creativity, delight? That's where we want to live, right? When we're there, our deepest longings are satisfied in God. When we're not there, we are looking to cope in whatever way, help, well, as you sort of hinted at, helps the fire to go out, puts the
Right.
fire out.
Yeah.
I think something that you said a second ago, I haven't even thought about it this way before. Maybe this is a good segue into
Yeah.
that question. Is with Chuck, when you were talking about how in your dysregulation turned into work for the kingdom of God. What strikes me about that is it's really easy. Well, I'm not going to say really easy. It's easier to pinpoint or to become aware of when our dysregulation leads to what is on paper pretty overtly unhelpful behaviors, addiction, whatever you would put in that, where you could go like, oh yeah, that's pretty clear that I'm dysregulated. But what you offer in
Like
that
the bad
sentence,
addictions, right?
yes,
The culturally
the bad things,
bad addictions,
Yeah.
But what you offered there is a really convicting thing to think about, which is that in my dysregulation, my dysregulation can turn into work for the kingdom of God. Like my dysregulation can show up in my counseling practice and how I'm helping people.
Yeah.
That's a lot more subtle to be able to see, right? In these like good things that I'm doing for my family or for the communities that I'm involved in.
Yeah.
And so maybe just real quick before Jamie goes into that question, which maybe this kind of ties into that question, is like, how do you begin to see that something that you're doing that is good can be out of a place of dysregulation?
That's a lot harder, I think.
Right.
I mean, I think that, like, for me, as you both know from reading the book, I ended up in a hospital
Right.
because of it. Because to live in chronic dysregulation is to live in a way that, well, it takes a toll on your body, to put it in simplest terms, right? And that's exactly what happened to me. So sometimes it takes life catching up to you. It takes marriage dissolving. It takes your busyness and your hyper arousal, as we were talking about, leading to ways of dealing with your colleagues on staff as a pastor or something like that that are harmful or hurtful to them. So, it's not quite as easy as it is with the so-called bad addictions, right?
Right.
Because these look good. And at least for me, people, you're rewarded for it. I think that's one of the things that I found in the work that I do, you guys, is because I do a lot of work with pastors who are, they'll say to me, I don't have a gambling issue. I don't have an eating issue. I don't have a sexual addiction issue. I don't have a substance abuse issue. But I do these 5-day, 15-hour intensives, right? And as we track their own unique embodiment of hyperarousal, what they'll realize is, well, but I do have a workaholism issue, if you want to call it that. This is maybe the simplest way to put it, right? And I've been living like this, since I was 5-6 years old. Why have you been living like this? That's the second question. Who told you? Well, as I look at my story, I realized that, mom was gone a lot, dad was gone a lot, and I was on my own, and I've always been on my own. And I guess that's all there is doing it on my own. And so I had to survive in hyperarousal. So the tricky thing is when you stop that cycle, and I've had a lot of pastors say this to me, a lot of people say this to me, but I'm thinking of pastors and leaders in particular who said, well, who am I then if I'm not me in hyperarousal? Which is to say, who am I when I'm not my, spiritually addicted part, my workaholic part, the part that is building things for the kingdom of God. People aren't going to like me. People aren't going to want to follow me. I'm not going to have the same energy for ministry. I mean, so it can be radically disruptive as we become aware of these cycles within us, and as we choose to live in a way that's more healthy and whole.
Yeah. I think that does lead into the great question that Blake seems to keep referencing here, which is...
Well, it's just because I haven't heard anybody talk about it, but I'm like, oh my gosh, that is the shift right there.
Yeah. Both of us heard you say this on a podcast as something that lingers for you of interest after having written Healing What's Within, and it hit us like a ton of bricks.
Which is another way to say we hope you write a book on this.
Yeah, we do. And then we hope to get to talk to you about it. The move from being self-aware to self-regulated.
Yeah. Yeah.
What you are suggesting is noticing
Yeah.
where you are hyper aroused in all of this, and maybe you're working with these pastors who are saying, I'm super self-aware. I don't have all of these things, and
Yeah.
maybe they're not aware of their workaholism, and you help draw attention to that. But even being aware of that is one
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, we're in a time where we're like obsessed over self-awareness.
Yeah.
And rightly so, because
That's a move in and of itself.
yeah, like
Yeah.
a lot of harm comes, even if you think of a family system, comes from a result of parents not being self-aware.
Right.
Yeah,
But
that's right.
to be self-aware is only half the work.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
what does it even mean to move from self-awareness to self-regulation? Why does that stick out as something of interest to you still?
Yeah, that piece is important in part because, and I'm doing some writing on this right now, but, when I first broke in as a pastor and a therapist in the early or late 90s, I should say, people weren't interested in these kinds of conversations, right? So if I was invited to speak to a group of pastors, it'd be a tough sell to talk about self-awareness. But then fast forward 10 years later, and I was being invited to some big church planter conferences, Redeemer, City to City, Spanish River, and people were becoming more curious. Pastors were becoming more curious about self-awareness and spiritual practices and things like that. As I began to do more consulting with churches, what I was noticing was that there were pastors who were eager to talk about the therapist they were seeing and the coach that had helped them and the Enneagram type that they were, and the kind of the different spiritual practices that they were engaging on their retreats as a staff, but who were living in chronic dysregulation. And the word that I used in the narcissism book was the word vulnerability, FAUX, a kind of performative self-awareness, which is to say, I've got my Enneagram and I got my spiritual practices and I got my therapist and notice the anxiety in my own voice. I'm doing this and I'm taking a retreat and I'm going to my therapist, I'm learning from my coach and I'm going to this seminar. That's a body in chronic hyperarousal. And so we've got this abundance of resources nowadays, but if they're not in service of something deeper, which is to say real character change at a deep level, real transformation, then then we're just kind of taking these things like, we're in a mall just sampling foods or something like that. There's no real substance to them. And so this is where I think even today, and I think therapists are implicated in this as well, we're marketing things about the nervous system and about self-help and self-regulation and self-reflection, all of these different things. But if they're not in service of deep, I call it character change, then we're just tinkering. And I think that's a problem that I'm seeing more and more nowadays is I've read these books and I've learned these things and I've got these resources and I've taken this class, but it amounts to tinkering and a form of addiction at some level too.
Yeah. I have so many questions, and I know we also need to land the plane.
Yeah.
So, is there some way, even now, as you're starting to think about self-regulation, that you're encouraging people to move away from the tinkering to some practical tools?
I'd never want to kind of sum it up in one thing, right? Because I think one of the beautiful things about this conversation is you guys do the work and that the thing that works for one person doesn't necessarily work for someone else.
Yes.
For years, I was talking about the importance of contemplative prayer, really believing the importance of contemplative prayer. But what my clients taught me, my particularly traumatized clients taught me, was that for me to ask them to spend 20 minutes in silence was like akin to death to their body and soul. They did not like that. 2 minutes of silence was horrifying, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot going on inside. And so what I would say is that we've got to slow way down and find people who are willing to do this deep work with us. And not just folks who are saying, well, try this resource and read this book and do this next thing. But someone who's uniquely attuned to your soul and your particular trauma, and who with you is willing to slow down long enough and spend long enough amount of time with you and is patient enough to discover how you might find your way back home, which looks different than my journey back home.
Yes.
And so, what's tough about that is that's not, if this is a word, Instagrammable or TikTokable,
Yeah, right.
or like you
Right.
can't just put that, there's not a solution that you could put into onto Canva and into
Yeah.
a box on Instagram, right?
It doesn't sell because it's not, what do they
No.
say? Simplicity sells in
Yeah.
marketing.
What it takes is, there was a courageous pastor that I worked with who had read some of what I had written about this subtle shift from self-awareness to self-regulation and said, I want to do that work. And we began working together. And what's particularly challenging, and I hinted at this earlier, is if you're willing to do that courageous work, you've got to ask, well, what are the implications if I shift from chronic dysregulation, chronic hyperarousal to home? What's the cost? What am I going to lose? And for a lot of us, I mean, for me, I'll talk personally, I lived in chronic hyperarousal for years. And so the shift was costly. I ended up leaving a job that I loved in San Francisco to move to the Midwest to slow way down. In making that shift, I took myself out of opportunities maybe to do bigger, better things that, would have advanced my career, but it felt really important to slow way down and to put myself in a place where I would be able to find my way to new rhythms, new practice. Well, the grass isn't always greener, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that someone else needs to leave their job. But for me, particularly after being hospitalized, I knew that something radical needed to happen. So what is it for Jamie? What is it for Blake? What is it for the clients that we see, right? So, it's not Instagrammable, if that's a word.
Yeah, and it can be completely disruptive is also something that I'm hearing you say. Like,
Very
you got to be careful signing up for something just because at face value it sounds nice, because you might be disrupting everything about you.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like we'll just have you back on for a part 2, and we'll just have a whole episode that talks about self-awareness versus self-regulation.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's an important distinction, an important conversation. So
It is.
Yeah.
Well, Chuck, we just think you're so cool, and we're going to keep reading what you put out, and just know that from afar, you're really encouraging the work of these therapists, but even more so these individuals. And we hope that everybody listening gets to experience the same encouragement, because I really just think you have an anointing with how you speak about these things.
Well,
Yeah,
thanks,
agreed.
Jamie. Thanks, Blake. Good to meet you
Yeah.
guys. Grateful
Yeah,
for the
you
work
too.
that you do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. And listener, thanks for being with us.
We're glad you're here. Keep coming back. You're worth it.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to another episode. Listen, we're working on some really practical resources to help you connect more deeply with yourself and others. So if you head over to our website, 3percentco.com, you can learn more about that. The link will be in the show notes. And this is the part of the show where we ask you for some help. Listen, we don't have a big fancy production team. We're recording these in my therapy office in between sessions and in the margins of our life. We just really believe in the message that much. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and rarely would I take the time to review and rate a show, just because honestly, I forgot. It wasn't until we started doing this show that I realized doing that actually really does help these platforms notice our show and get the word out. And so if any of this is impactful to you, we would love it if you took a second to leave us a review, rate us, or if you want to just do it the old-fashioned way, text this link to a friend and say, hey, let's talk about this episode. Whatever you do, make sure to follow us on whatever platform you're listening to so you never miss an episode. We're really grateful you're here, and we'll see you next week.
So let's be honest.